The Father's justice. Every Sunday morning, I make coffee the same way I have for decades. 2 measured scoops, never 3. From the same metal canister my late wife used to keep on the second shelf above the stove. My name is Robert Caldwell. I'm 66 years old, and this house has been quiet for a long time now. The light that morning came in low through the kitchen window, catching the edge of her photo on the shelf, the one from a trip we took years ago, her smile still frozen in that late afternoon sun. I reached for the canister without thinking, and that's when I noticed it. Just behind the frame, something small, matte, black, out of place, in a space I knew, down to the inch. I didn't touch it. I leaned in slightly, just enough to see the pinhole lens, the side port, the exact shape of a consumer-grade recording device. Cheap, easy to hide, and not something that appears by accident. I set the canister down and let my hand rest on the counter. The coffee machine clicked softly behind me as it started its cycle, water heating. Steady, familiar. I kept my eyes on the shelf, taking in every detail without moving anything. No dust disturbed, no frame shifted. Whoever placed it had done so carefully, recently. I poured my coffee and stood there a moment longer, looking past the window into the backyard. The oak tree still where it had always been. I didn't rush. I didn't react. In my line of work, you don't grab a live wire just because you see it. You trace it. You understand it. Then, you decide what to do. So I walked down the hallway instead, slow, deliberate, into the bathroom. I opened the cabinet beneath the sink, pushing aside a few spare rolls of paper. And there it was again, same size, same finish, tucked just far enough back to avoid notice. I closed the cabinet gently, and for the first time that morning, I realized this wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't random. So the question became, who had been in my house long enough to put them there, and why? Over the past year, the changes hadn't come all at once. They settled in slowly, almost politely, the way small shifts tend to do. Andrew started calling more often, not unusual at first, just checking in, asking how I was doing. But then the questions began to narrow. What I had for breakfast, whether I'd gone out that day, if I'd remembered to pay the electric bill. He would pause after I answered, just a second too long, like he was measuring something I couldn't quite see. Sophie's approach was quieter, more deliberate. She didn't ask as many questions, but when she visited, she paid attention to things that didn't concern her before. One afternoon, she stood in the hallway a moment longer than necessary, glancing toward the back room where I keep my filing cabinet. Another time, she offered to help organize my paperwork, said it lightly, almost casually, as if it were a favor I'd been meaning to ask for. They both started bringing up the same idea, not directly, not forcefully, just suggestions placed into conversation. A smaller place might be easier to manage, fewer rooms, less maintenance. Andrew mentioned how complicated property taxes could get. Sophie followed with how she could keep an eye on things for me. I remember standing in the kitchen during one of those conversations, the afternoon light cutting across the counter, watching their reflections faintly in the glass of the cabinet door. At the time, I told myself it was concern, the kind that comes with age, with family wanting to help. But looking back, there was a pattern, consistent, patient, and pointed in one direction. And the thing is, I was never struggling. The house was paid off years ago. I had savings, investments, enough structure in place to handle my own affairs without anyone stepping in. Andrew knew that. Sophie knew that. So if they already understood I didn't need help, why were they so careful about offering it anyway? I waited until the next morning before making the call, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted my thoughts in order. Jonathan Pierce answered on the second ring. His voice was steady, the same as it had been for years, measured, precise, never in a hurry. I told him what I had noticed, the devices, the changes, the details that didn't sit right. He didn't interrupt. I could hear the faint shuffle of paper on his end, the quiet rhythm of someone already organizing information. When I finished, There was a short pause. Not uncertainty, just calculation. Then he spoke, calm, direct. He said there was a possibility I needed to consider. Something people don't think about until it's already too late. Guardianship. A legal process where a court can appoint someone to take control of another person's finances and decisions, usually under the claim that the individual can no longer manage their own affairs. I stood by the kitchen counter, one hand resting against the wood, listening as he explained it step by step. Evidence gets collected, patterns of confusion, forgetfulness, inconsistency. Medical support is added, statements, evaluations, sometimes legitimate, sometimes not. Then, a petition is filed. If granted, the appointed guardian doesn't just assist, they take over. Bank accounts, property, decisions, all of it. Jonathan didn't raise his voice, didn't dramatize any part of it. He simply laid out the structure the way it exists. If something like that were filed successfully, Andrew and Sophie wouldn't need to wait for anything. They wouldn't need permission, or timing, or even my agreement. They would already have everything. I looked toward the hallway as he spoke, the quiet of the house settling in around me. The air felt still, like something had already shifted without making a sound. "They're not waiting for you to pass, Robert," Jonathan said finally, his tone unchanged. "They're trying to establish control while you're still here." I let that sit for a moment, the weight of it settling into place with a clarity that left no room for doubt. They weren't waiting for me to die. They wanted me to disappear on paper. And if that process had already started, how far along were they, really? I didn't call Andrew back that day, and I didn't confront anyone. In my line of work, you don't grab a live wire just because you see it exposed. You trace the circuit first, understand where the current is coming from, and then you decide where to cut it. That's how I approach this. Quiet, methodical, controlled. The next morning, I pulled a chair into the kitchen and sat facing the shelf where I knew one of the devices was hidden. I let the room settle into its usual rhythm, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft tick of the clock above the doorway. Then I started speaking, not loudly, not theatrically, just enough to carry. At first, it was simple things. I asked myself what day it was, paused as if I couldn't quite recall. I mentioned a doctor's appointment that didn't exist, then corrected myself halfway through the sentence. I stood at the sink once and said a name out loud. Wrong the first time, then close, but not quite right. Nothing dramatic. Just small inconsistencies, the kind that don't raise alarms immediately, but stay in your mind afterward. I kept it measured. No sudden changes, no exaggerated confusion. If you push too far, it feels false, and I needed this to feel real enough to be believed. So I spread it out over days, sometimes nothing at all, sometimes a brief moment, like a flicker you're not sure you saw. In the afternoons, I'd walk through the house slowly, speaking under my breath as if I were trying to remember something just out of reach. At night, I left a sentence unfinished, then moved on as if I'd forgotten what I meant to say. Every action had a purpose. Every pause was placed where it would be noticed, but not questioned. I wasn't losing control. I was demonstrating it in pieces. And the more consistent I became, the more I had to ask myself, how long would it take before someone on the other end decided they had seen enough? The shift in Andrew was almost immediate. Not obvious to anyone else, but clear if you knew where to look. He started calling more often, sometimes twice a day, his voice steady, but the questions sharper. He wanted details now. What I had eaten, whether I'd left the house, if I remembered to pay a bill he knew I never missed. There was always a pause after I answered, just long enough to suggest he was listening for something beneath the words. I gave him exactly what he was looking for, nothing more. A hesitation here, a slight correction there, just enough to keep him leaning forward. I could almost picture him on the other end, phone pressed to his ear, noting the inconsistencies as they mattered more than the answers themselves. Sophie's visits became more frequent, but she moved differently. She didn't ask direct questions at first. She watched. Her eyes moved through the room in quiet passes, the edge of the kitchen counter, the hallway, the door to the back room. When she did speak, it was soft, offering to help sort paperwork, asking where I kept important things, her tone light but her attention fixed. One afternoon, she stood near the doorway longer than necessary, her gaze resting on the filing cabinet at the end of the hall. She smiled when I noticed, stepped back, just enough to make it seem casual. But the moment lingered, small, deliberate, and telling. I didn't challenge any of it. I stayed in my role, steady on the surface, just uncertain enough underneath. Every reaction they gave I stored away. Every glance, every pause, every shift in tone. And after a few days, something became clear, not through anything they said outright, but in how they carried themselves. They believed it. And that was the moment I understood. The trap was starting to close, just not in the way they thought. Jonathan Pierce didn't call immediately. He took his time, the way he always does when something needs to be verified properly. When his name finally appeared on my phone, it was late afternoon, the light in the kitchen turning softer, stretching across the table in long lines. I answered, and before I could say anything, he told me to sit down. His tone hadn't changed, still calm, still precise, but there was a weight behind it now. He said he had checked the county filings, pulled records that weren't easy to find unless you knew where to look. There was already a petition in place, filed quietly, without any notice reaching me. Sophie had submitted it. He said her name clearly, no hesitation. She was listed as the primary petitioner, the one requesting emergency guardianship on my behalf. Andrew's name followed right behind it, co-signed, supporting the claim. I stood there with the phone against my ear, looking at the edge of the counter, noticing a small scratch in the wood I hadn't paid attention to before. Jonathan continued, describing the contents of the filing. It outlined a pattern of cognitive decline, memory lapses, confusion, and inability to manage basic financial responsibilities. The language was clinical, structured, designed to sound objective, but every detail in it was something that had never actually happened. Then he mentioned the medical letter attached to it. Dr. Lucas Bennett. I didn't recognize the name, and I said as much. Jonathan had already looked into him. His license had been revoked years earlier in another state, tied to a case involving fraudulent certifications. He wasn't authorized to practice. Not there, not here, nowhere that mattered. Yet his signature was on the document, confirming that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. I walked over to the window while Jonathan spoke, watching the backyard settle into the evening. The oak tree stood still, the same as it had that morning, unchanged, unaffected. They built a case, Jonathan said quietly, paper by paper, step by step. There was no speculation left in his voice, no room for interpretation. Everything he described connected cleanly. Names, signatures, timelines. It wasn't a possibility anymore. It was already in motion. I didn't feel surprised, not in the way people expect. The pieces had been there. This was just the moment they locked into place. What mattered now wasn't whether it was real. It was how far they were willing to take it, and how much further they had already gone without me knowing. Once everything was clear, I stopped waiting and started planning. I sat at the kitchen table with a notepad, not writing much at first, just mapping the sequence in my head. In my line of work, you don't rush a system you're about to test. You build it carefully, step by step, so when the current runs through it, everything holds. I called Helen Ward that evening. She lives 2 houses down, has for years. She didn't ask many questions when I told her I needed to stay over for a night. Just listened, then said I could use the guest room as long as I needed. Her voice was steady, practical. That was enough. The next morning I drove across town to a hardware store where no one knew me. I bought 2 small indoor cameras, better quality than the ones already in my house, with a wider field of view and reliable storage. Back home, I moved through each room slowly, considering angles, entry points, lines of sight. One camera went high in the corner of the living room, angled toward the hallway and front door. The second, I placed it in the back room, positioned directly across from the filing cabinet and the doorway. I tested both, checked the feeds on my phone, adjusted them by inches until everything lined up. Then I turned to the part that mattered most. I took a sheet of paper from the drawer and wrote a short note in my usual handwriting, slightly uneven, like something I might have written and set aside. Documents. Safety deposit. First National. Box 7. Don't forget. Key in blue envelope. I read it once, then folded it. Unfolded it again, leaving soft creases along the edges. When I placed it on the kitchen table, it looked like it had been there for days. There was no safety deposit box, no account, no envelope. I packed a small bag, nothing unusual, a change of clothes, a few essentials. Before leaving, I walked through the house one last time, checking each room the way I always do. Lights off, windows secure, everything in place. The devices they had installed were still where I'd found them, untouched. By mid-morning, I locked the front door behind me and drove to Helen's. Her house was quiet, the curtains drawn just enough to let in a soft, filtered light. I set my bag down in the guest room and took out my phone, opening the camera feeds. Both angles were steady, clear, waiting. Every step had been measured, every detail placed with purpose. Now there was only one thing left to see. Who would come through that door, and what they would be willing to do once they believed no one was watching. At 11:14, the front door opened. I was sitting at Helen's kitchen table, phone in my hand, watching the feed as Andrew stepped inside, where he belonged. He didn't hesitate, didn't call out, just closed the door behind him and moved straight down the hallway. He was alone. That mattered more than anything else. No Sophie, no second set of eyes, no witness. He went to the back room first, opened the filing cabinet and started pulling folders out one by one, placing them on the desk in quick, controlled motions. Papers shifted under his hands, pages flipped. His phone came out, and he began taking photos without stopping. There was no uncertainty in what he was doing. He knew exactly where to look. After a few minutes, he moved into the kitchen. That's when he saw the note. He picked it up, read it once, then again, slower. I watched his posture change, just slightly, the kind of shift you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. He set the paper down and turned toward the cabinets, opening them one at a time, top shelf, bottom shelf, checking places that didn't make sense unless you believed something was hidden there. The cameras caught everything, every movement, every drawer opened, every step measured and deliberate. And in the middle of it all, the device he had placed weeks earlier sat quietly under the sink, still recording, still active, capturing him from an angle he hadn't considered. He stayed for nearly 2 hours. When he finally left, the house looked almost the same, but not quite. Things had been moved, touched, disturbed, in ways only someone searching would leave behind. I didn't move from my seat. I didn't need to. Because by the time Andrew was driving away, the footage was already secured, and someone else had been notified. The rest unfolded quickly. What I didn't know yet was how he would react when he realized the door he walked through so confidently had never really been open at all. The legal process took time, slower than anything that came before it. There were hearings, documents, and statements read into the record under steady fluorescent lights. In the end, Andrew and Sophie both entered pleas, no long speeches, no explanations offered that changed anything. Just signatures, terms, and consequences were set in place where they could no longer be adjusted. I didn't attend every session. I didn't need to. By that point, the outcome wasn't the part that mattered most. The following week, I had the locks changed. I stood on the front porch while the technician worked, the metal clicking into place one cylinder at a time. It wasn't dramatic, just quiet, practical. A boundary reset in a way that didn't require words. After that, I sat down with Jonathan Pierce and finalized the structure he had suggested. A revocable trust, clear terms, controlled access, everything documented properly, everything where it should have been from the beginning. The house felt different afterward, not empty, not damaged, just rearranged in a way I couldn't quite point to. Some things you don't notice until they're gone, and some things you only understand once they break. I didn't feel anger the way people expect. That fades quicker than most realize. What stayed was something quieter, the absence of a version of my son I thought I knew. Maybe it had been there once, maybe it hadn't. I don't spend much time trying to decide which is worse. There's a lesson in all of this, though it's not the kind people like to repeat. Money can shift how people see you, but it doesn't create respect, and it doesn't guarantee loyalty. And silence, the kind where you step back and watch instead of reacting, that isn't weakness. Sometimes, it's the only way to understand what you're actually dealing with. A few mornings later, I was back in the kitchen. Same routine, same canister on the shelf, the light coming in at that angle. It always does this time of year. I poured my coffee and sat down, letting the quiet settle the way it used to. Outside, the yard was still. Nothing moving, except the shadow of the oak tree stretching across the grass. For the first time in a while, everything felt clear, not perfect, but steady. And as I sat there, looking at the place I had built and kept for all these years, one thought stayed with me longer than the rest. What would you do if the people you trusted most were the ones trying to take everything from you?